about what is the cost of state capture. So how does state capture affect ordinary people? And a little bit about the enablers of state capture, the interests at play, the why. So the enablers in their different hues, so to speak, as well as to talk about some of the recommendations that we've seen from the report. So what are these recommendations? And what do we think about these recommendations? How can we organize around these recommendations? There are two comrades who are here with us to help us in this conversation. So think about them as conversation starters for today, but hopefully everybody will then step in to sort of have this conversation. These two comrades are from Open Secrets. So there's Michael Marchant, right? Michael Marchant from Open Secret, and Michael is the head of investigations at Open Secret, and then we've got Comrade Zen Mathe, and Zen is an investigator. And they've got different areas of focus, but they will talk more about that, just so that you get to know them better. And Open Secrets, most of you know Open Secrets as an organization that uses research, that uses advocacy and the law to basically expose economic crimes, but to also call for accountability against the private actors that commit these crimes. Is that correct? So that's who is with us today. This is, like I said, the first Chisimani seminar for the year. We are also streaming live on our platforms, YouTube, and on Facebook and on Twitter. So we'll also be having the conversation with people who are online, who are also free to field questions and comments and all of that. So welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm going to hand it over to Mike and to Zen, and then we'll basically be having this conversation, and then I will open up for questions, for comments. So we give them about 40 minutes or so, and then we have a conversation around this. Is that okay? Thank you so much, comrades. I don't know who starts first.
Hello. Thank you, Pindile. As you mentioned, and good evening to everybody, both online and in person. Myself and Mike will be trying our best to speak to some of the Commission's findings. I think, as Pindile has said, we were in conversation yesterday. As much as we do some of this work and we're engaged in a lot of this work, I think this first quarter of the year has been very off the cuff responses with the release of the reports, and so we've only had so much time to investigate and then look through those, even though we've been involved in this work. And I think with comrades in civil society and partner organizations that are also involved in this work, and with the public in general and the media, we're all in conversation with the release of the findings so far. And I think, as Pindile said, the first question is really digging into the findings of what the Commission has made so far. And I think Mike will want us into a conversation around that to begin with. But just to place us into context before Mike kicks off into some of the focusing in on part 1 and part 2 of the Commission's report, I'll place us into the broad discussion of what the Zondo Commission is and how it emerged, just to bring us into the space a little bit. And the Zondo Commission really emerged following the directive from Public Protector's Office, which was led by Untitled Chapter at the time, to really look into very specific recommendations that were made that then became the terms of reference of the Commission, and became what the Commission was tasked to look into at the time. And it was actually instituted by the former president now, Jacob Zuma. Even though we have seen, I think for those that know and for those that don't know, a difficulty from the Commission side to bring former presidents to testify. It was during the presidency that the Commission was instituted. And I think what followed was that following the public protector's recommendation and institution by former President Jacob Zuma was that in 2018 the Commission began its mandate and its work, and the Commission has been ongoing from that time and has been really conducting its hearings for over now it's almost 4 years. And what we found is that there's been over 400 witnesses being called, and even the Commission itself found at the time that its terms of reference, which began to, as instituted by the Public Protector's Office, as quite narrow. What then happened with the calling of witnesses was that I think it opened the scope for the discussion and really what the Commission then had to deal with the people and the witnesses that were coming forward and what was brought forward by the Commission through the workings of the Commission, and what could ultimately not be ignored by what was being found and exposed during the process. And so even though the Commission's work during its process widened, the Commission then did a process of narrowing in the final year and a half to say, this is what we've been tasked to do. And I think since 2018 and the last hearings of the Commission ending last year in 2021, we now have the Commission releasing what it amounts to be a 3-part report. The first, which has been released, and the second, which has also been released, and the third, which is forthcoming, which we're looking forward to towards the end of January. And I think that is the context in which we're finding ourselves having this conversation today. So part 1 and part 2 of the Commission's report focus on various volumes. The first focuses on 3 volumes, and the second focuses on 2. And I'll hand over to my colleague Michael to speak to some of those findings before speaking to some of the others.
Thanks very much, Zen. And is no? Yeah, exactly. Great. Evening, everyone. And thanks very much for joining us this evening. Not to disparage the people who are joining us online, but I must just say before I dive into this, it is very, very nice to be in a room with comrades again, to be able to speak face to face. Is one of the first times, definitely for me, in a very long time that I've been able to do this, and it's really great not to be behind a Zoom screen myself. But also for those of you behind the screen tonight joining us, thank you for doing so. So like Zen has said, what we're going to try and do this evening is have a bit of a conversation between ourselves, and I hope it's not too disjointed, but we are going to bounce back and forth between Zen and I quite a bit. And that is partly because we have different areas of focus that we've been working on for many years. And so, Zen, as you'll hear, is much better able to speak to what's happened at our revenue service and the role of the consultants like they and there. But I've been looking a little bit more closely at entities like South African Airways and Transnet over time. And so, for each of the 4 questions that Pindile has kind of posed to us, we'll bounce back and forth. But so to start off with this question around the findings of the Zondo Commission so far, when we were preparing for the event, Pindile, you mentioned maybe starting with this question of defining state capture. And I think, to be fair, Zen and I kind of pushed back and were like, please don't ask that. We don't want to start with that question. But then when I thought about it more and more, I thought that it might be important as a starting point to put something out there, I suppose, as a provocation, which is that so far in the 1,500 pages that the Commission has released in the 2 reports, Judge Zondo hasn't provided us what his understanding of state capture is, right? And that is a little bit of a difficulty. Now, one of the things about having these several volumes that deal with different parts of state capture is it definitely makes it easier for us to dig into the individual findings about specific entities. But what it does make difficult is it makes it quite difficult right now to identify what the Commission's got right and what is missing. Because there's lots of things that we certainly think at this stage is fundamentally missing from the report. But of course it is possible that the judge is going to deal with that in report 3. And so it makes it a little bit tricky to assess some of those things. And there are going to be a couple of things that we raised tonight where we say, well, we think that this is a glaring omission so far, and it's possible that in that final report at the end of the month, that analysis suddenly is there. I would just say from the outset, we certainly think that Justice Zondo has left himself a lot to do in the final report. There's a huge amount of material that hasn't been covered yet, and so it's going to be, the Commission is clearly under a lot of pressure to get that material out. But to focus on what the findings have been and what we think some of the key findings are so far. The first one, I think maybe just to touch on this in relation to Transnet, is that while the Commission hasn't made clear what its understanding of state capture is, it's been quite clear when it comes to what happened in the corruption that occurred at Transnet, in particular the capture of procurement contracts there. The Commission has referred to it as a racketeering enterprise. And I think it gives us the first hint of what the Commission understands as state capture, and I think is a fairly helpful way to think about it, which is that racketeering implies a group of individuals and entities and companies that are systemically involved in a series of crimes that are all directed towards benefiting that association of people, right? And so state capture is made up of a range of individual crimes. There's individual fraud, there's individual corruption in procurement contracts, there is the destruction of boards, which Zen is going to talk to in a little bit more detail, violations of the PFMA and all of those things. But the real point and the real thing that you get to at Transnet is that all of those things are part of a systematic effort to repurpose our institutions for the private gain of a set of entities that are related. And what the Commission does point out, specifically with regards to Transnet, but also a range of other entities, is that what the Gupta family and what their kind of connections did so well is to use a series of entities, corporations and front companies and those things that appear on face value to be just another company vying for a contract, right? And they would use the various deficiencies in our law and things like that to hide the fact that these were the same interests behind these entities. And what we'll get to a little bit later, and I think the thing that's missing from the report, are some of the ways in which our law and international and global laws allow people to do that, allow people, companies and individuals to hide behind secrecy, to put up fronts with ease in order to gain money from corrupting procurement processes, and then to siphon that money around the world before anyone can keep track of it, right? And for those things not to be dealt with. And so the description of the Gupta enterprise as a racketeering enterprise is helpful because it brings home the systemic nature of what occurred, right? And what you begin to see in the first 2 volumes of the report is that there was a pattern in the way that these entities went about capturing our institutions. And they had to do very similar things in each and every entity that they went to. The first thing they had to do is they had to purge the institutions of the board members and the other people who worked there, who had just become very used to doing things the way that they were supposed to be done. And when you look back at what the report has found, I suppose the encouraging thing to remember is that many of our institutions were, although patchy, were performing their basic functions very well. So Transnet is a good example of this. Transnet had a very skilled finance department. There had lots of people who'd worked there for many years, who knew how to go to the bank to get a loan, right? Those kind of very simple things. What the Gupta family and their acolytes, people like Salim Essa, Eric Wood, and regiments, for example, realized is that what they had to do is they had to get those people out of those positions. And so one of the fundamental things is that many people who gave many years to public service, civil servants in our state-owned enterprises and in other entities, basically had their careers and their lives ruined for trying to stand up to this coordinated attack, right, on those systems. And that was the first thing that they had to do. That to get those people out of the way so that they could capture these very lucrative public procurement budgets. The next thing they had to do, and this is what they did at Transnet very effectively, is they just had to make sure that they had people in place to massively inflate contracts that they could then assign to their friends. And what they did at Transnet's a great example is they ensured that people like Brian Molefe, Anuj Singh, and others were put into very senior positions at the board and as group CEO to suddenly sign off a 16 billion rand escalation, right, in the cost of the procurement of trains, as a good example. And they did that escalation because they needed enough buffer to stream off the kickbacks that they could provide both to the Gupta family but also to all the individual fixers and middlemen that were involved in all of the deals. So then that's the second part, I suppose, of the system. And then the final one, and it's the part of the system that we will probably return to most during the course of this evening, is that they roped in the private sector to assist them in doing their deals. And this is the thing you see in each and every instance of state capture, right? Is that you have one of the big four audit firms, you have one of the big law firms, you have one of the big banks, either domestic or international. And what you do is they rope them into that system and they use the veneer of legitimacy that you could get from using those types of entities in order to both facilitate the movement of money, and Transnet is a great example of this. You know, the billions of rand in kickbacks were sent around the world almost instantly via HSBC. HSBC ran the accounts, they sent the money to Hong Kong, they sent the money to Dubai without a second thought, right? So you needed the banks to be able to move the money, and you needed the law firms to sign off, and the consultant firms like McKinsey and Bain to sign off on what were obviously ridiculous contracts, and yet they were signed off by these big multinationals who were really just happy to have a finger in the pie and be able to extract a fee and a commission from doing those kinds of things. And maybe the final example I'll use, and I've been speaking for a little while, so I must throw back to Zen, but South African Airways is a wonderful example of this. I think we all know about Dudu Myeni. Dudu Myeni has probably received more newspaper column inches or whatever, bandwidth, right, than many other public officials over a number of years at SAA. And it's unsurprising due to her personal relationship with the president. And the Zondo Commission first report makes clear that one of the reasons that Myeni was protected at South African Airways for so long was because she was very close to the president, and it was made clear to a series of ministers that you wouldn't remove Myeni if you wanted things to go well for you. And the commission is unambiguous. Myeni systematically destroyed any control mechanism there was at South African Airways to ensure that the basic systems, right, could work. And she definitely did it deliberately, and there's a reason that the court has now declared her a delinquent director for life. But the other thing that the Commission raises at South African Airways is that PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, one of the biggest and most renowned and wealthiest audit firms in the world, audited South African Airways' financial statements every year in which, from 2013, when Dudu Myeni was chairperson of the board. And every year, PwC said that there was not a single thing they could find wrong with the accounts. They didn't flag any problems with internal controls. They didn't find any problems with the way management was treating people in the organization. And they said the financial statements were absolutely fine. The Auditor General comes in 2017 and says, that's all a lie. The financial accounts are completely wrong. SAA has absolutely no internal controls. It's about to run out of money. And this institution has been systematically hollowed out. PwC then deny everything for 4 years until they're dragged before the Commission and forced in a series of testimony to admit that they failed over a number of years despite receiving nearly 100 million rand in audit fees for that entity. And the reason I use that example, I think, is that there's no where you can compare the amount of attention that PwC and Dudu have received, right? We hear about Dudu incessantly, and PwC managed to slide under the radar for many years. And that is a persistent problem that we've had in the way that state capture has been characterized. And I think just before I hand back to Zed, what I would say for the first two reports is that the Commission has been inconsistent in the way that it flags the role of the private sector enablers. In some of the sections it picks them out and it does well to identify what they did wrong and says they must be held to account. You know, the Commission has recommended, for example, that Nedbank is investigated and may be prosecuted for its role at Airports Company South Africa. And yet then we get to the second report in the section on Transnet, and the entire section on the banks is missing. And I'll speak to this in more detail later. What I would just say, the final thing, is that it's been a bit patchy so far, and it's one of our concerns that we have, is how much is the private sector's role really going to be explained in that final report. But yeah, Zen, sorry I've been talking for a long time, let me hand back to you on SARS and Denial.
Thanks, thank you, Mike. We have not been speaking too long at all. Just to pick up from where Mike has left off, as Mike mentioned, in the part one of the report, there's 3 volumes, and the first one is SAA, the New Age, and SARS, and the last part of the report focuses on procurement. And in the second part of the report, we have this focus on the SOEs, Transnet, and Denial. And as Mike has highlighted, speaking to certain findings and hits, misses, and opportunities that have, and open secrets, as we like to frame things. We don't want to just praise the Commission without being critical of it. And I think some of the ways that we've done it as a team is, and as an organisation, as you've heard Mike speak to the findings, is we've really framed it as what has the Commission got right, what has the Commission missed, and what are some of the opportunities that are available through the recommendations that it offered. And I think, following from what Mike has said, I'll now focus, I think, just speak to a little bit of some of those with regards to SARS and Denial. And I think the main, just to stick to that framing that we as a team have looked at in terms of hits, misses, and opportunities, with regards to SARS, which is South African Revenue Services, we found that it was a little bit of a surprise, to be honest, to find that SARS featured in part one of the report, and it wasn't in the terms of reference of the Commission, and that's why it was a surprise. But I think the Commission does well to frame why it was important to include the capture of SARS in the first part of the report, and it does that by really saying that there was state capture at the country's tax revenue service public institution. And why that is important, the Commission really puts forward, is that SARS is the way that the country enables, it provides social security mechanisms. SARS is the bedrock in so many ways of our democracy and the bedrock of the state in terms of financially providing, whether it's social grants or whatever social security protections that the state has to offer are enabled by SARS. And so any capture of SARS is really a capture of, it's one of the biggest disservices to the public of the country that can happen. And so I think even though the Commission, we're critical of it in so many ways, its focus on SARS is something that was welcomed in the first part of the report. And what it does in that first part is to really highlight the capture that was enabled by Bain, which as Michael has mentioned, we've seen a huge miss in some of the ways that the Commission hasn't really focused on the private sector enablers that made state capture and corruption possible at our public institutions. However, at SARS, there's a unique hit there where the Commission really does focus on Bain and Company. And just to put Bain and Company into context, Bain is a US-based management consulting firm that opened shop in South Africa around 1997. and it forms one of the big management consulting firms in South Africa with BGC and McKinsey. And just to place that into context, they are a huge private sector enabler, which has been spotlighted, correctly so, for enabling capture and corruption at SARS. And just to speak to that, SARS would not have been able to be captured by the likes of Tom Muyane and former President Jacob Zuma without the help of US-based consulting firm Bain. And I think that's one of the major things that we found as an organization that the Commission has done well, to really spotlight how the private sector has enabled capture and corruption. And I think we'll speak to this later, what the cost of that is to the public of South Africa. But just that was a big hit to really say that in the findings of the Commission and in the report that came out in the first part, that highlighting that Bain was part of the capture of the public revenue service from conception to collusion to capture was one of the main things. However, we found in the findings and the recommendations of the Commission are two separate things. So we found that in the report, the Commission puts forward various findings, but when it made the recommendations with regards to Bain and the conduct, it kind of shied away from something that could have been stronger. It made strong findings and provided evidence and put forward really critical points of criminal violations, to put it tentatively, and to put it in a way, that still needs to be proven in the court of law. But those are the things that we found that the Commission did right in the first part of the report. However, we find that in the recommendations of the Commission, they shied away from really recommending that Bain gets investigated for some of those things, beyond a suggestion for the MPA to interrogate some of their contracts. And I think that was one of the ways where, even though there was this great thrust towards the Commission to put the private sector forward in enabling capture, there was a lack of follow-through from findings to recommendations at that point. With regards to the second part of the report on denial, the Commission does well to trace the capture of the institution from back to in 2017, and I think that speaks to and traces the capture of denial through not only the contemporary capture, which happened in around 2010, but traces it back to one of the first contracts that happened from arms court to denial in about 2017. And I think what that allows us to do is to draw the trajectory to say that capture isn't, and state capture and corruption in the way that we understand it isn't time bound in the way that sometimes is portrayed and understood. And I'll pass back to Mark to really kind of take us through how following the second part of the report and the findings, for example, until that trace the trajectory of capture and corruption at the state institution beyond 2010 is the beginning point, but it doesn't fully encapsulate capture and corruption in our country in the way that in reality it actually has happened. So,
yeah, thanks, Zen. So that kind of takes us to the second question that we were kind of asked to, I suppose, provoke a discussion on, which is about the conditions that pave the way for state capture. And on this first point, I mean, there's a few that I want to touch on, and we've covered some of them a little bit before, so I'll try and be a bit briefer. But the Commission faced a very difficult job, because it was given a very specific terms of reference to look at the allegations covered in the Public Protector's report, as Zen has said. And so, I mean, one of the things that happened, for example, Open Secret's faced this question as soon as the commission was announced, right? Does Open Secrets support expanding the terms of reference to consider, to go all the way back to apartheid and before, right? To really follow the trajectory, given that so much of our work was focused on that. And it was a difficult discussion, but I mean, our position was clear in the end, is that no, because then if essentially what you're asking the commission to do is go on this kind of endless thing, and isn't the job of the commission to do that, rather than finding political solutions to those issues. But what it means is that what is absent from the commission by definition, right, is this recognition that the conditions for capture come from an absolute failure of South Africa's democratic transition to deal with corrupt criminal networks that span private and public sector, particularly from the apartheid state and beyond. And I say particularly then from the apartheid state, particularly from the late 70s and the sanctions period, because I mean, our position is that the criminal networks took on a very specific manifestation during that period, and they used many of the similar kind of secretive systems that we see in state capture, and we can draw the line between a lot of the individuals who are implicated in those networks that then survive a democratic transition that doesn't put them under any scrutiny and certainly doesn't hold any of them to account, and their ability then to capture new elites and bring those elites into new corrupt systems. And so the kind of obvious link that we have tried to draw in the past, just when talking about state capture and corruption in the South African state more broadly, is that of course the apartheid state, particularly for the last 20 years, is propped up by a group of what we might call deep state actors, which are global corporations, intelligence agencies, banks, and others that want to prop up the apartheid regime and make an absolute killing out of it at the same time. And a large amount of that involves illicit provision of arms and the ability of the apartheid state to move money around the world in secret and hide the fact that they are procuring those arms, right? In the 1990s in South Africa, so many of the people who are facilitating the corrupt arms deal in 1999 and approaching new ANC elites are exactly the same actors that were facilitating sanctions busting in the late 1980s. Almost all of the French and German companies that benefit from the corrupt arms deal were the same companies that had benefited from massively inflated prices under the sanctions regime. And of course, many of the middlemen and fixers for sanctions busting in general soon become kind of senior ANC policy advisors to president after president. Tony Georgiadis is a good example of this as someone who facilitated the provision of oil to the apartheid state in violation of the embargo, and then becomes very entwined with ANC elites and is able to act as a fixer between capital and the state. And I suppose the point of that is that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and since then, really didn't do much at all to try and untangle the corporate and private networks that benefited from those networks, and the range of other private networks that benefited from corruption during apartheid in general. And that, of course, doesn't even begin to address the much more kind of fundamental mineral energy complex. I mean, if you look at the TRC's business hearings, we're really talking about a day, right? A day or two in which those issues were dealt with. And so there's a failure to deal with what we have kind of called the long shadow of apartheid, and the failure to disrupt criminal networks and what it means for how they manifest again. And one of the other reasons I raise this is just to say is that it is an absolute lesson in what will happen if you don't pursue accountability and disrupt the networks that have facilitated state capture. Because they will reform, they're already reforming, and they will perpetuate the same acts again. And even if it's new entrants and new players, they will use the same architecture to move money. They'll use illicit gains to continue to protect themselves and shield themselves from accountability. And that's certainly a global phenomenon. The other things, and I'll mention these three very briefly because the one I've already touched on, when you're talking about the conditions that pave the way for state capture, the one is a global financial system that preferences secrecy and the ability to hide your identity and move the proceeds of crime through your bank accounts without anyone raising the alarm, right? So it's emerged at the Zondo Commission, particularly towards the end, that the Gupta family was laundering its money that it got from our state-owned enterprises through the same systems that global terrorist organizations use through HSBC Bank to launder their funds, right? This is very much a global phenomenon. The fact that Dubai and Hong Kong profit from allowing people like Salim Essa to set up secret companies without anyone asking any questions, and HSBC will give you a bank account, and then you've had a company for 3 weeks and Transnet pays you 16 billion rand to pay for something that your company has no track record of ever doing, right? When you put it like that, it's absurd. It all sounds absurd. And yet when HSBC were like, I wonder if we should move this money, they just did it, right? Did they comply with the law? It's not clear. When FNB moved the Estina money to Dubai, when it was supposed to be linked to a Free State farming contract, our systems are set up to protect those types of transactions, and that's a massive problem, and it's something the Commission hasn't grappled with yet. And when we come to recommendations, I think we can return to that. And then the final two in terms of conditions that paved the way for capture, the kind of obvious one, maybe doesn't need saying, is that those networks needed to gut our law enforcement institutions. They needed to disband the Scorpions, they needed to target independent-minded people within the MPA and the Hawks, and they needed to make it a deeply unpleasant place to work, so that not only were people who wanted to pursue accountability removed, but they became such awful institutions that people left en masse, leaving them with massive resource constraints and really an inability to grapple with these kind of complex financial crimes, right? And we see that today. The MPA and the Hawks lack the kind of financial expertise to unpack some of these complex cases. And then the other thing, and I'll return to this on recommendations, is just an abject failure to protect our whistleblowers. We have known about so much of the state capture material for such a long period of time because those people within SOEs and other places blew the whistle and tried to draw attention to the fact that this stuff was happening, right? Our law just doesn't make enough provision to protect those people and those whistleblowers from being hounded by the entities that they blow the whistle on. And if you don't have the kind of protection for them, people can raise the alarm about things that are happening, but they can be silenced. And if you couple with that with a deliberate attack on the agencies who are supposed to investigate those crimes, you have this vicious cycle where actually many things, become public knowledge. You read about it in the papers, and nothing happens, and the extraction can continue. You might set up a slightly different company, change the name, for example, state capture regiments, essentially the interest behind regiments become trillion, but they engage in exactly the same content over time. So those are the things, I think from a private sector perspective are the kind of the enabling things. But there's obviously all the stuff on the public sector side about procurement and boards. But then I think you want to discuss those in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Mike. I think just to pick up on what Mike was speaking to, before moving on to some of the saying enablers, I think I'll speak to that in terms of saying it was not possible for the money to be moved, that was moved, to move without the banks moving it. And it's quite literally simple. So when we're talking about private sector enablers and state capture, we're talking about bank institutions that flag for you, you have insufficient funds to swipe your card when you're buying something, right? I mean, they can do that. And that means, of course, they are the door to, or the door opener or the door closer for whether or not money moves. I think, if there's suspicious activity on your car, the bank flags that. And when we're talking about ordinary day-to-day things and we bring it down to really understanding it in that way, I remember the first time in this conversation, when I first went Open Secrets, I thought, that's crazy. That is absurd. There is no possible way that the amount of money that was moving, and has been moving and continues to move, can move without the banks. It's not possible. And when we're talking about private sector enablers, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about really it's exactly that. You have banks that are stopping us and from transacting at Pick and Pay and Spot, me personally, and flagging suspicious activity in our cards, but they can't flag billions of rands or dollars being moved between country to country. I mean, and then on top of that, in terms of what Michael was saying, enabling is not just saying, oh, what, you know, and whether you're moving it in small amounts repeatedly or whether in big amounts over time, you as a bank are aware of those transactions and you are allowing them to happen. And if somebody, whether it's a junior person or a senior person within your banking system or an organization is possibly flagging that, which we have found in what Mike was talking about, the hounding of whistleblowers, you get hounded by the system. And so I think when we're talking about how capture happened, there's a sense of a network of fear that was created in private sector organizations by those that had the power to do so. But also beyond that, you're talking about a lack of disruption of networks that are corrupt. And when we're thinking about possible ways to change the system, we're thinking about individuals on the ground that have the courage to flag certain things, and they're not hounded like our whistleblowers have been, which is the case. What then, and how do we think about the ways around that as a country? But beyond that, to flag two other points and what paved the way. I think what Michael has mentioned is the historical shadow of capture and apartheid. What I like to call the fault lines of our country. Now, Mike, he doesn't like jargon, but fault lines. It's almost in geography. Fault lines are predisposed cracks in the system, in the earth, beneath the surface, that allow when something crumbles for the tremor to be felt throughout. And so I think as a democratic nation, what we're really dealing with in so many ways are fault lines of an apartheid state. And so what we're saying in so many ways is that corruption and capture didn't arrive with black democratic government. It really is almost, not almost, but in its fullest sense, an inherited state of the nation. And so when we are trying to think how we move past that, I mean, which is not the question of how capture happened, even though it is, we're really thinking about what did we inherit, and how are we confronting that, and how do we move forward from really facing what we inherited, and not using it as an excuse, but also just arriving at our reality and looking through how we move on past that. And I think my third thing, before moving on to the next question, is very technical. How capture happened was to strategically place individuals in key positions and to do your bidding. And that is a great deal of what happened. And so when we're talking about the gutting of boards of said institutions, it's really one of the main mechanisms through which capture happened. It was, let's remove individuals and place those in strategic areas where we can make in key decision-making points. For example, in Denel, when Lynn Brown, who was placed, which the Commission found as the Public Enterprises Minister, to gut the Denel board against the public enterprises, against your department's recommendations. She placed a board that then went on to bring the SOE to its needs. And we find that in key state institutions and various areas, that was the mechanism of capture, was to replace individuals and place particular people in strategic positions to allow them to make the decisions that allow for capture to happen. And I think I think those are some of the points that I wanted to touch on. I'll pass them to Mark to talk about the next question.
Cool. Thanks. Just from an anecdotal point of view, so I have to add this because one of my favorite, maybe the wrong word, but with Denel, such a wonderful example. Lynn Brown went to Parliament and said, this was the previous Denel board, I think it was late 2014, early 2015, that was one of the best SOE boards she's seen. She was Minister of Public Enterprises. She wishes she could deploy that board to the boards of other SOEs because they'd solved the issues out. And 3 months later, she fired all of them, right? Plucked Daniel Mancha from obscurity, someone who'd already been struck off the roll of attorneys, and appointed him. Now, it was so egregious and so obvious at the time that it was an abuse of power, right? That here was a minister clearly making decisions that weren't in the interests of the entity. And yet there didn't seem to be a way to kind of deal with it. And we will get to it on the recommendations, but it is interesting that Zondo has called to criminalize abuse of power, because I think what the Commission has seen in this instance is that there's lots of times that politicians have discretion to do stuff, and it's not obviously criminal, but it's clearly for an ulterior purpose. And so this notion of criminalizing those kinds of things, I think is interesting. Pindila, I think that we are pushing time, and so we will accelerate, we promise. Let's try and wrap up this part of the discussion so it can be a bit more back and forth. But so the third question in terms of the costs of state capture, I just have one or two things that I want to flag. First thing is just to say, it's one of the most obvious things that Zen and colleagues and I have said is missing from the Zondo Commission report so far, is that if you pick up the 2 volumes, you could be mistaken for thinking that state capture didn't really affect you and I. It is a little bit bizarre. We would have thought that the Commission would have made very clear up front when it discusses these reports what the consequences are, not just for the people at Denel who don't get paid their salaries, but for people who face an austerity budget as a result of years of mismanagement and the looting of public funds. That so far is missing from the analysis. But if you want to talk about the costs of state capture, you have to start, I think, with the legacy of public debt in South Africa and what it means for the state of our fiscus. So at the moment, South Africa's public debt sits at over 4 trillion rand. Towards the end of last year, Treasury said that the state was paying over 300 billion rand a year to pay off our debt, which means that for every 5 rand that SARS earns in taxes, 1 rand of it goes to service debt repayments before it goes to anything else. And that is the legacy of state capture. I mean, that is it kind of first and foremost. Of course, the fact that the ANC government is pursuing an austerity budget can also be put down to a catastrophic failure of political imagination and this kind of inexorable trend that austerity is the only way to end issues of fiscal issues. And I think that's a political discussion that has to take place. But you can't ignore the fact that the state does face this incredible debt problem, in part because our state institutions were looted, and they were roped into debt on terrible terms on purpose by entities like Regiments and Trillion, led by people like Eric Wood, because they made money in the margins. Every time they could get a public entity to take on debt at higher interest rates, they could skim money off in the middle, right? And so that is one of the fundamental things. And then the other, and this is the most obvious cost, is that when you gut public institutions, you gut their ability to provide services. And so this hasn't been covered yet. This will be coming in the final installment of the report. But PRASA is a wonderful example. Millions of South Africans have been unable to take trains for years now, even though it should be, and in many places, the most affordable way to get to and from work. because a group of people at PRASA manipulated procurement processes to contract with people to extract massive kickbacks, to either buy trains that weren't fit, or in contracts that then fell apart so that the delivery didn't take place. And those kinds of things are the actual impact of what state capture has done to the country. There's a few last things I want to say in terms of the recommendations, but then I want to turn back to you for costs that you wanted to flag.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I'll touch on two things, so that in light of time, as Mike has highlighted, so we can have a broader discussion. Following from what Mike has said, I think returning back to trying to focus the conversation on the findings of the Commission so far and the reports that have come out. Mike has very clearly highlighted the reality that it can be so simply put in our minds or in anyone's mind that state capture hasn't affected us. But it has affected every single one of us. And to go very specifically to Null, for example, in the second report, you have a state institution that could not pay its workers. Its salaries. So Null could not pay its workers its salaries for months. And I know when I'm waiting for my salary, I'm waiting for my salary, and I think we all are waiting for our salaries, and that is one of the most, egregious crimes and unethical things that can happen. When someone is expecting a worker and an employee of a state institution is not receiving their salary and doesn't know when it's going to be coming, and has no explanation as to what has happened and to when and to when it will be paid, I think that if you put yourself in that position, that's some of the most direct in terms of so far in the recommendations and the reports that have come forward for the Commission, the most glaring thing that has come forward. Beyond that, just looking at SARS. As I've mentioned, SARS is the revenue agency of the country, and without which we cannot provide any social protection services to the country as a whole. And just to be clear, between 1998 and 2009, 2007, SARS had doubled, had put in mechanisms and built capacity to double the tax collection agency's output. And it moved from about 2.1 million taxpayers to 4.1 million taxpayers. And what that did is that it had a rippling effect on the state's fiscus and the abilities for the state to provide social services and the money available to the state to do what the state does. However, what happened in the capture of SARS was that it slashed what SARS was able to gain from the country, and the amount of taxes and money it had built capacity to collect by 50%. And when you're talking about a lack of being able to provide social services and increase debt and not being able to have a buffer to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, you're talking about a state that is without revenue from its tax collection agency. And so when we're talking about the bottom line with regards to the people that have suffered, because of state capture and corruption, it's all of us. Everybody in South Africa are victims. State capture is not a victim's crime. I think there was a time when that was going around and it was being said, state capture is a victim's crime. And it's very clear in the situation that we face in the country right now, and some of the lack of our ability to, as a state, to respond to, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, and to provide a basic social income grant, that state capture is not a victim's crime. And I think in some of the ways that Open Secrets is engaged in this is we held a people's hearing on state capture back in 2019, in 2019 and we provided a platform and engaged with activists and civil society organizations for people to come forward and to speak to their situations. And we had an open mic kind of night and day where people were able to come forward and speak to their situations following, prompted by the context of state capture and corruption. And the stories that came forward were quite literally organizations such as Equal Education coming forward to say that, the state capture and corruption has meant that textbooks are not being able to be delivered to schools around the country. It meant that organizations like Section 27 were coming forward, which is a civil society organization that works with health around the country, to say that there's been ambulances and healthcare around the country has not been able to be delivered. And the general public coming forward to say, this is the situation in my community, and this is what we are facing as a country. And that was a stark reminder when we put all of that together to say what, to really put forward, the cost of capture and corruption, and to really highlight, which we then submitted to the Zondo Commission to say, this is what the people of South Africa are saying. We're not speaking for anybody, we're speaking all from our own perspectives. I have this to say, Michael has this to say, and this person has this to say, and this is what people in our country are facing and what they are saying about it. And we submitted that to the Commission, and just to speak to that, highlighting the cost of capture as civil society, as activists, remains important and is pivotal to really driving home that state capture isn't a victimless crime.
Thanks, Zen. So just on the recommendations as the final thing, maybe to prompt the discussion going forward, because this is the title, what next? From our perspective, or certainly from my perspective, I can kind of characterize the recommendations of the Commission so far as, the good, the bad, and the missing. I think there are things there that are really encouraging, and things that can be organized around them and pushed. There are things there the recommendations that I think we should be cautious of, and we need to have a conversation about what they would really mean. And there's some things that the Commission so far has failed to grapple with at all, and something that I think collectively we need to think about how we deal with those. But from the good, I think the most obvious one is that the strength of the Commission is that it's given us a very clear agenda for prosecutions. Under each section, there is a very clear sense of who needs to be prosecuted and for what. The Commission has used sometimes, I would say, kind of soft language. It's always like further investigation to establish whether there can be a prosecution. I think the Commission's done that because it recognizes that the rules of evidence are different for commissions and courts, and so ultimately the MPA needs to decide. But I don't think the Commission would be recommending people for consideration for prosecution if it didn't believe that there was enough evidence basically to support that. And there are reams of people who need to be prosecuted. The thing that we have been saying for a long time, and I want to stress, is that this is not just the big, complicated prosecutions of the racketeering enterprises. It's also the smaller, low-hanging fruit prosecutions of people for individual violations, right? So in South Africa, it's a crime not to report corruption. It might seem funny to say that, because it doesn't appear that anyone has been prosecuted by the MPA for that. In fact, in all the years that the Prevention and Combating Corrupt Activities Act, PRECA, has existed, the MPA has done one prosecution. It's also only ever done one prosecution for the violation of our Public Finance Management Act, which lays out in very clear terms how you need to protect the public procurement process, right? And so, one of the central things I think that needs to be done is to put really much greater pressure on the MPA to act with haste, to prosecute people, remove them from the system, and also to show a trend of accountability, to establish for people on a very basic level that there will be consequences. And that goes from the public service all the way through to the private enablers that we've been discussing at such length today. I think it would do absolute wonders, right, for the country if chief executives, senior bankers, senior auditors were prosecuted for their complicity in these types of crimes. And it's something that we'd be ahead of the curve in a lot of other countries that haven't done this. That takes me to one of the things I'm very worried about from a recommendations perspective, is that the Zondo Commission has supported calls for deferred prosecution agreements. This is something that the MPA has said they want to do for a long time, and there are certain groups within civil society more broadly that have supported this. And to be clear, Open Secrets is very skeptical of this. What a deferred prosecution agreement is, or a DPA, is it's an agreement between our prosecutors and usually a corporate entity to say, tell us what happened, pay back a little bit of the money, give us some information, and we won't prosecute you for what's gone on. And the MPA says they need to do this because they don't have the resources and the ability to go after the kind of big prosecutions. Our concern is that where these systems, where the DPAs are used in the world, places like the United States and the United Kingdom, what they tend to do is ensure impunity for large corporations. Large arms companies and banks enter into deferred prosecution agreements all the time. In fact, HSBC was subject to a deferred prosecution agreement with authorities in the United States for money laundering offenses while it was laundering money for the Gupta enterprise, right? If anything should raise alarms about how effective those are at accountability, I think that's a good example. And so the fact that the Commission has put its weight behind that is something I think we need to be cautious about. As civil society, if DPAs are going to be made policy, we need to make a real noise about how they're made policy, making those DPAs publicly accessible, for example, and so we know the terms, and that they're not done in backdoor deals between prosecutors and chief executives. And then the final thing, the missing, I've said this before, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but I think what's missing is how do we, and this is also on a global level, how does our state push for reform of global finance, right? And international solidarity to ensure that the kind of financial secrecy that enables corruption on a grand scale and things like state capture, that those things are changing. That the United Kingdom and the United States can no longer allow this kind of global financial secrecy to prevail. And it's not clear to me that the South African government is making enough noise about this on a global scale. They're never going to get the money back from state capture unless you go and challenge on a global at a global level how these systems are supported. And that's something so far that the Commission hasn't touched on, and that I think civil society can be making a lot more noise